I had just slid the lift hook into the drain cover in front of my house when Delaney Cross, the president of our homeowners association, came running across the lawn and called 911. She screamed that I was destroying shared property, poisoning the neighborhood, and threatening a woman simply because I would not accept my place. The officer who answered the call ordered me to set my tools down, and I did. But when black water began pushing up through the slats of that cover, he caught the smell of chemicals and knelt down to open it himself. There was more than mud waiting underneath. There were buried bags that someone had worked very hard to make disappear. The sky over Alder Crest had turned the color of wet slate, and the forecast said the storm would arrive in under 8 hours. I was kneeling beside the drain in front of my house, hook in hand, preparing to lift the metal grate before the rain came. Black water had already begun seeping up through the seams even though the sky had not opened yet, and I did not like what that told me about the pressure building below. Delaney's white SUV swung into my driveway at an angle that blocked my own truck, and she was out of the vehicle before the engine had finished ticking. She told me to put the tool down immediately, that the drain belonged to the association, and that no resident had the authority to touch it. I laid out what I had brought with me, the drainage corridor map, the maintenance clause from my deed, the email I had sent the board 3 days earlier, and photographs showing the water already rising against the flow. She did not look at any of it. She told me I was a man with a metal hook who had convinced himself he ran the public works department, and when I kept working anyway, she pulled out her phone and dialed emergency services. On that call, I heard her say that I was tearing apart the community drainage system, that I was carrying a dangerous metal implement, that I had lost control of myself, that she felt threatened because a man would not take an order from a woman, and that opening the drain could release poison into the street. That last part caught in my chest before I even understood why. I had never once used the word poison in front of her. I had said contamination, I had said hazard, I had said unknown material, but never that specific word, and a woman who claimed she had never gone near that drain seemed to already know exactly what kind of danger was waiting under it. Officer Adrian Cole arrived within minutes and told me to step back and set the hook on the grass, which I did without argument, though I warned him that the drain was blocked and the pressure below it kept climbing by the hour. Delaney stood behind him with the satisfied look of someone who believed the uniform had just proven her right. Then a thick ribbon of black water broke through the seam of the cover, and Adrian's flashlight caught the corner of an orange plastic bag pressed against the underside of the grate, a warning symbol still visible on its surface. He turned to Delaney and asked her a question that would follow us both for weeks afterward. If she had never opened that drain, how did she know there was something toxic underneath it? The confidence on her face went stiff, and for the first time since she had come storming across my yard, she did not have an answer ready. To understand how we ended up kneeling over that drain with a police officer and a bag of buried construction waste between us, you have to go back 6 months, long before the sirens, long before the storm clouds, back to the summer when a clubhouse renovation quietly turned our whole street into a place worth burying something under. Alder Crest was a neighborhood of just over 40 homes built around a red brick clubhouse that most of us treated as the unofficial heart of the community, the place where holiday parties and board meetings and summer barbecues all happened under the same peaked roof. My house sat at the very end of Bracken Hollow, nearly 6 feet lower in elevation than the clubhouse itself, and the storm drainage from 3 connecting streets all funneled into a single grate in my front yard, before continuing on toward the retention pond at the edge of the property line. When I bought the house 8 years earlier, I had walked through every page of the paperwork with the kind of attention that comes from having spent a career inspecting municipal water systems. and I knew that while the drain itself sat inside a county drainage easement, the deed made every homeowner along that corridor responsible for keeping their portion of the surface clear. For most of those 8 years, the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Water came down the slope after a hard rain, gathered at my drain, and disappeared without incident. I spent years in that line of work before starting my own surveying business, and there is a particular kind of comfort in watching an engineered system behave the way it was designed to behave, a small proof that somebody, somewhere, had done their job correctly. My neighbors used to joke that I paid more attention to the storm grate than most people paid to their own roof, and they were not entirely wrong, but a lifetime spent reading water for a living tends to leave a person with instincts that do not switch off just because they are standing in their own front yard. Everything changed after Delaney pushed through a full renovation of the clubhouse, a project that replaced the insulation in the ceiling, tore out the old vinyl flooring, stripped water-damaged drywall from 2 interior walls, swapped the air conditioning ductwork, and removed sections of roofing material that had been sitting up there since the neighborhood was first built. Within weeks of that project wrapping up, every light rain left standing water across my front lawn, and the grass nearest the drain turned yellow and then died completely, spreading into a dead ring nearly 3 feet wide. I remember crouching down in that dead patch of grass one morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, running my fingers through soil that smelled faintly wrong in a way I could not yet name, and understanding on some level that the problem in front of me had started somewhere I had not looked yet. I filed a report with the board and asked for an inspection, expecting a routine response. Instead, Delaney wrote back that the drainage system had functioned perfectly until, in her words, a man living alone decided to turn his front yard into a personal engineering project. At the next board meeting, she did not let me finish presenting what I had found, interrupting to tell the room that this was what happened when a man owned too many tools and had too few people at home willing to listen to him. A handful of people laughed the uncomfortable kind of laugh that comes from not wanting to take sides, and I did not react. I simply asked, once the laughter died down, whether the board had inspected the drain after the clubhouse renovation was completed. Delaney told the room the contractor had handled everything according to code and that the association held a completion certificate to prove it. Tessa Marlowe, the treasurer, looked visibly surprised at that claim and asked which certificate she meant. But Delaney had already moved on to the next agenda item before anyone could press further. After the meeting, Tessa pulled me aside and admitted quietly that she had only ever seen a single combined invoice, with no wait tickets, no facility receipts, and no environmental documentation attached to it anywhere in the file. That conversation planted the first real seed of doubt in my mind, because a completion certificate that nobody could produce was not the kind of thing an honest project left behind. Whatever was wrong with my drainage, I was starting to believe it had nothing to do with rainfall and everything to do with what had come out of that clubhouse. Tessa quietly slipped me a copy of the financial report that had already gone out to every member of the association, and one line near the bottom stopped me cold. It read removal and disposal of regulated construction material, $34,600, paid to a vendor called Harbor Ridge Environmental. I ran that name through the state business registry that same night and found a company that had been formed only 2 weeks before the clubhouse renovation began, registered to a rented mailbox address, carrying no hazardous waste transport license of any kind, and listing a contact number that, when I dialed it, rang directly through to Delaney's own property management consulting office. I could not prove she owned the company outright, but the trail was already far too strange to ignore. I reached out to Gideon Price, the general contractor who had run the clubhouse project from start to finish, and at first he was reluctant to say much of anything. Once I explained that water was now backing up into my front yard, though, he admitted that his crew had come across certain materials during demolition that required special handling under environmental regulations. He had submitted an estimate for proper disposal, but Delaney told him she had already arranged a different vendor to take care of that portion of the job. Gideon remembered clearly that a stack of orange-bagged material had been staged behind the clubhouse when his crew left the site for the weekend, and that within 2 days those bags were simply gone, with no licensed transport vehicle ever seen coming or going during daylight hours. Evelyn Sloan, a neighbor who lived within sight of the clubhouse and had spent her career handling insurance claims before retirement, overheard me asking around and offered to show me footage from her own doorbell camera. At 12:43 in the morning, an unmarked pickup truck pulling a small trailer rolled slowly past her house heading toward the clubhouse. Nearly an hour later, the same truck came back the other direction, trailer empty, moving faster than it had on the way in. The route from the clubhouse to the front gate did not pass anywhere near her camera, but the truck had turned toward the far end of Bracken Hollow, and there was only one place down that stretch of road where a vehicle like that could reasonably stop, which was the open ground surrounding the drain in front of my house. I walked my own yard afterward and found a strip of soil that had clearly been dug up and then covered with fresh sod, running in a narrow line from the edge of the road straight to the mouth of the drain. When I asked Delaney about it, she told me it was routine landscaping maintenance, nothing more. I pushed a soil probe into the ground near the drain cover to check for myself, and at roughly 18 inches down the probe struck something soft, something with the give of heavy plastic sheeting rather than packed earth. A faint, acrid smell clung to the metal tip when I pulled it back out, sharp enough that I stopped digging immediately rather than risk disturbing whatever was buried there without proper protection. I filed a formal inspection request with the county that same afternoon and sent a notice to the entire board stating that no one should disturb the area around the drain until an inspector arrived to evaluate it properly. By the next morning, Delaney had already sent a crew to spread a fresh layer of gravel across the ground surrounding the cover, smoothing over the very disturbance I had asked everyone to leave untouched. She was not repairing a drainage problem. She was trying to bury it deeper before the county could get anywhere near it, and the more I watched her scramble to cover her tracks, the more certain I became that whatever sat beneath that grate was going to be worth far more than an argument over a soggy lawn. Delaney began building a story designed to strip away whatever credibility I had left in the neighborhood. She sent an email to every household in Alder Crest, accusing me of tampering with shared infrastructure, spreading unverified claims that were causing needless panic, harassing female members of the board, and using my professional background to intimidate anyone who dared to disagree with her. She warned that opening the drain without authorization could void the association's insurance coverage entirely. Nowhere in that email did she mention the $34,000 invoice, and nowhere did she mention the material that had come out of the clubhouse walls and ceiling months earlier. I replied briefly, attaching my photo documentation and formally requesting that the board preserve every record related to the renovation project. Delaney showed up at my house later that same afternoon, standing on my porch, to tell me I was turning a minor maintenance issue into a witch hunt because I could not tolerate the idea of a woman holding real decision-making power. When I asked her directly why Harbor Ridge Environmental's listed phone number rang through to her own consulting office, she went quiet for a moment before telling me that men like me were always inventing connections just to feel smarter than the people around them. She offered me a deal before she left. The association would drop any pending fines against me if I withdrew my inspection request, stopped contacting the contractor, signed a written agreement not to open the drain, and publicly admitted I had misread the entire situation. I told her no. As she turned to walk back to her car, she glanced at the drain cover one last time and said that if I opened that thing, I would be personally responsible for whatever came out of it. A warning that only made sense if she already knew something was waiting inside. Grant Bellamy from the County Stormwater Division called me not long after that conversation to explain he could not send an inspector out until the following Monday due to staffing shortages, but he warned me a significant storm system was expected to hit by the weekend. If the drain remained fully blocked, the runoff had nowhere to go but into my house, and likely into the 2 homes beside mine as well. He confirmed by email that I was authorized to clear surface obstructions on my own property to prevent emergency flooding, as long as I did not descend into the drain itself or handle any material that appeared suspicious. I decided I would only lift the cover far enough to photograph the blockage and assess the flow, nothing more. I gathered protective gloves, safety glasses, the lift hook, a chest-mounted camera, my deed paperwork, Grant's email, and a neighbor who agreed to stand at a distance as a witness to whatever happened next. I sent one final notice to the full board explaining exactly what I intended to do and why. Less than 5 minutes later, Delaney replied with a single line telling me I would not be opening that drain. And something in the certainty of those words told me she had already decided how she planned to stop me. By Saturday morning, the wind had picked up and the clouds along the horizon had turned nearly black. The air smelled the way it does right before a real storm, heavy and metallic, and the leaves on the oak tree at the edge of my property had already started turning their pale undersides toward the sky. I started recording before I touched anything, stating the date, the time, and the condition of the drain cover out loud for the camera, noting that black water was already rising through the seams despite the fact that the rain had only just begun to spit. My hands were steady, but I remember being acutely aware of every sound around me, the wind moving through the trees, the distant rumble that was not quite thunder yet, and the low gurgle coming from somewhere beneath my own feet. The moment I slid the hook into the grate, Delaney appeared again, this time with a board member trailing behind her and her own phone already recording. She positioned herself close to my camera and announced loudly that I was endangering community safety. I kept my distance, said nothing provocative, and handed her a copy of Grant's authorization email, which she did not bother to read. Instead, she put her phone on speaker and dialed 911 in front of everyone, describing me to the dispatcher as an agitated man holding a metal implement, tearing apart shared equipment, refusing to listen to her instructions, and potentially about to release toxic material into the neighborhood while using my size and my voice to intimidate a woman standing nearby. I did not raise my voice or move any closer to her while she spoke. She kept needling me while we waited for the officer to arrive, telling me this was not my garage, that having tools did not give me permission to open whatever I pleased, and that men like me always believed technical knowledge put them above the rules everyone else had to follow. I only reminded her that everything happening in that moment was being recorded. When Officer Adrian Cole pulled up, dispatch had told him a man was holding a metal object, so he immediately ordered me to set the hook down and step back from the drain, and I complied without hesitation. Delaney smiled and demanded that Adrian arrest me for property destruction on the spot. I handed him my deed and Grant's email instead, and rather than simply taking her word for it, he read through both documents carefully. He asked who actually owned the drain, and Delaney insisted the association had managed it since the neighborhood was first built. I pointed out that management was not the same thing as ownership, and that the association had never once performed maintenance on that drain in the 8 years I had lived there. While they argued, the pressure below the grate made the cover shudder, and black water surged up through the gap, dragging a torn scrap of orange plastic along with it. Adrian crouched down and shined his flashlight directly onto the fragment. Part of a printed warning was still legible across the surface, reading regulated material, "Do not dispose." Delaney immediately insisted that I must have planted it there myself, and I asked her, calmly, how a bag large enough to carry that kind of material could possibly have passed through a sealed grate without anyone opening it first. She had no response. Adrian ordered everyone to move back, called for fire department support and an environmental unit, and used my own hook to lift the cover a few inches for a better look, releasing a sharp chemical smell the instant the seal broke. Under the beam of his flashlight, rows of orange bags sat pressed down into the bottom of the hole, buried beneath layers of soil, broken brick, and fragments of ceiling material that matched exactly what had been torn out of the clubhouse months earlier. Adrian's body camera recorded every second of it, and a shipping label still attached to the nearest bag would soon lead directly back to a contract Delaney herself had signed. Adrian lowered the cover back into place immediately and sealed off the area, refusing to declare the material toxic outright since that determination would require a proper environmental assessment. Still, the sealed packaging and the deliberate burial made it clear this was not ordinary yard waste. Delaney tried to regain control of the situation, suggesting the previous homeowner might have buried the material years earlier, hinting that I might have staged the evidence myself, insisting the drain belonged to the association and fell outside police jurisdiction, and repeating that she had only called because she feared an out-of-control man might do something reckless. Adrian asked her 3 simple questions in a row. If she genuinely did not know what was under that drain, why had she told the dispatcher I might release poison the moment it was opened? If the material had been buried for years, why did the soil covering it look freshly disturbed? And if I had been the one to place those bags there myself, how had I managed to open a sealed grate without her own camera ever catching me doing it? Delaney could not give him a consistent answer to any of the 3. One of the uppermost bags carried a delivery label listing its drop-off location as the Alder Crest Clubhouse, dated during the exact week of the renovation, and pressed against it were broken sections of ceiling tile, with the same distinctive pattern visible in photographs of the clubhouse taken before the remodel began. Fire crews arrived shortly after, establishing a proper safety perimeter and instructing everyone present to avoid contact with the standing water. Grant Bellamy was called in on an emergency basis, and once he arrived, he confirmed within minutes that the drain had effectively been converted into an illegal waste containment site. The bags were blocking nearly the entire outflow path, and Grant explained that a heavy storm hitting a blockage of that size could send water flooding into my home, into the 2 houses beside mine, out across the street itself, and possibly all the way down into the retention pond at the far end of the neighborhood. When he asked who had authorized digging in that area, Delaney claimed she did not remember. Evelyn Sloan arrived shortly afterward and handed Adrian the doorbell footage, showing the unmarked truck heading toward the drain in the middle of the night, and Delaney accused Evelyn of conspiring with me to destroy her reputation. Adrian told Delaney firmly to stop making accusations and to remain on scene for a formal statement. For the first time since this entire confrontation began, I watched something shift in her expression. The moment she realized the officer she had summoned to remove me from that yard was no longer looking at me with any suspicion at all. He was looking at her, and the questions had started flowing in her direction instead. I stood behind the safety tape and watched my own lift hook, lying forgotten in the wet grass, the very tool she had called the police to stop me from using, and understood that her frantic call for help had done nothing but deliver police officers, fire crews, a county inspector, and a running body camera directly to the one place she had worked so hard to keep hidden. The site remained sealed off for 2 full days, while a licensed disposal company collected samples and confirmed that a portion of the buried material required specialized transport procedures under state environmental law. Investigators also recovered insulation panels matching the clubhouse renovation, sections of flooring tile still coated in construction adhesive, discarded air conditioning filters, soil visibly contaminated with equipment oil, and several bags still bearing lot numbers that matched line items from the original renovation invoice. There was no body, no weapon, nothing manufactured for shock value. What had been buried there was simply the physical proof of greed and a genuine hazard to everyone living along that street. Tessa went back through the association's bank records once the site work was underway. The full $34,600 had indeed been transferred to Harbor Ridge Environmental. But from there, the money split apart. $22,000 moved into a consulting account tied directly to Delaney's own business. $7,500 had been withdrawn as a cashier's check. The remaining balance appeared to have paid a handful of day laborers for a single overnight job. Not $1 of that $34,000 had ever gone to a licensed disposal facility. Gideon Price handed investigators a set of text messages Delaney had sent him during the renovation. One read, "Do not include that material in the final report. I have already arranged a cheaper option." Another, sent the same night Evelyn's camera caught the mystery truck, read simply, "Use the hole at the end of Bracken Hollow. Cover it with dirt before sunrise." Gideon explained he had not taken part himself since his crew had already left the property by then, but he had known Delaney was bringing in outside labor to finish the job her own way. I sat with Tessa one evening while she walked me through the ledger line by line, and what struck me most was not the size of the missing money, but how carelessly it had been hidden, as though Delaney had never seriously believed anyone would look closely enough to notice. The consulting account tied to her business had received the largest transfer within a single business day of the original payment clearing, a pattern Tessa said she had seen before only in cases where someone was moving quickly to get funds out of reach before anyone thought to ask questions. Delaney had apparently told that overnight crew the drain had been decommissioned years earlier and no longer served any functional purpose. In reality, it was the primary drainage line for 3 connecting streets, and she had knowingly risked flooding my home along with the homes beside mine simply to avoid the cost of proper disposal. When police returned to take her formal statement, her account shifted again, this time claiming she had only approved what she called temporary storage and had no idea the laborers intended to bury anything inside an active drain. Adrian brought her own text message back up on his screen, the one instructing them to cover it with dirt before sunrise, and Delaney requested her attorney before answering another question. No charges were filed against her that same afternoon, but a formal investigation opened covering false reporting during an emergency call, illegal dumping and burial of hazardous material, misuse of association funds, concealment of a conflict of interest, and submission of falsified financial records. I did not feel any satisfaction watching it unfold. The storm was still bearing down on us, and the drain that carried 3 streets' worth of runoff remained partially blocked no matter how many charges were eventually filed against the woman responsible for blocking it. Whether I had actually saved this neighborhood or simply set off a disaster exactly as Delaney had warned would depend entirely on what happened once that storm finally arrived. The environmental crew worked through the following day under real-time pressure to clear the bagged material out of the drain before conditions worsened. Grant inspected the pipe itself and found sediment and debris packed nearly 20 feet down the line, cutting the available flow capacity to roughly 15% of normal. A specialized vacuum truck was brought in to clear the obstruction, and I assisted by providing old survey drawings and pointing out the exact location of the outflow point near the retention pond. Careful not to touch any of the material myself so the process stayed both safe and properly documented. Delaney remained outside the sealed perimeter, working the phones and calling board members one after another, sending out an email claiming I had manufactured a crisis by, in her words, provoking government agencies into unnecessary action. Tessa responded to the entire neighborhood within the hour, attaching the county's own confirmation that the drain had been blocked by material originating from the clubhouse renovation. It was the first time a fellow board member had publicly contradicted Delaney in front of the entire association, and it would not be the last. By late afternoon, the pipe had been cleared enough to restore reasonable flow. Rain started falling steadily around 8 that evening, and I stood under my porch overhang watching water gather from 3 separate streets and funnel down toward the drain in front of my house. In the first few minutes, the water rose faster than I liked, and I worried the line still had not been cleared thoroughly enough to handle a storm of this size. Then I heard a deep pulling sound as the water began spinning down through the opening, moving exactly where it was supposed to go, out toward the retention pond instead of pooling in my yard. My lawn stayed dry. The 2 houses beside mine stayed dry as well. Grant told me afterward that if those bags had still been sitting in that drain, water would almost certainly have flooded the lower level of at least 3 separate homes before the night was over. Delaney had spent weeks insisting that opening the drain was the reckless act that threatened this community. In truth, the only genuinely dangerous decision made on this street was her choice to keep that drain sealed shut in the first place. By the next morning, the body camera footage and the full site report had already been filed into the official record. Nobody could dismiss those buried bags as the imagination of a man who simply enjoyed stirring up trouble any longer. The association called an emergency meeting, and Delaney announced she planned to attend in order to correct what she described as slanderous claims being spread against her. I understood she was nowhere near finished fighting, but this time she would not be facing me alone in a front yard. This time the entire neighborhood would see exactly what that officer had seen underneath the drain cover with their own eyes. The clubhouse meeting room was packed, and directly above our heads sat a freshly finished section of ceiling built from the very same material that had once been buried beneath that drain. Delaney took her seat at the head of the table as though nothing had happened, opening the meeting by describing herself as the target of a smear campaign led by, in her words, a man who could not tolerate being led by a woman. I let the accusation sit in the air without responding to it right away. Tessa asked to play the original emergency call recording that had already been entered into the public record, and the room listened as Delaney warned the dispatcher that opening the drain might release toxic material before anyone had ever confirmed there was toxic material at all. After that came the body camera footage, showing me complying calmly with every instruction I was given, showing Delaney repeatedly demanding my arrest, showing the black water rising through the seams, showing Adrian discovering the warning label on the bag, showing the shipping tag that traced back to the clubhouse, and showing Delaney's explanation shifting 3 separate times within the span of a single conversation. Gideon Price walked into the meeting himself and confirmed under oath that the buried bags belonged to the renovation project. He read the text message aloud in which Delaney instructed him to use the hole at the end of Bracken Hollow and cover it before sunrise. Delaney claimed Gideon was retaliating because he had not been awarded a follow-up contract, but Tessa placed the association's financial records on the table in front of everyone, tracing the money from Harbor Ridge Environmental straight back to an account connected to Delaney's own consulting business. Delaney tried once more to turn the room against me, insisting I had spent weeks stalking her, digging through private records and using my technical background to intimidate a woman doing her job. Tessa cut her off before she could finish, telling her plainly that I had only asked questions, and that Delaney was the one who had buried the answers underground. It was the sharpest line spoken in that entire meeting, and I watched several longtime board members exchange a look that told me the balance of power in that room had just permanently shifted. I only added a few words of my own. I told her she had called 911 because she believed a uniform would keep me away from that drain cover forever, yet she had never counted on that same officer arriving with a body camera pointed directly at the ground she had worked so hard to hide. For a long moment, nobody in that room said anything at all, and I could hear the air conditioning humming through ductwork that had been installed during the very renovation, now sitting at the center of the accusations against her. Delaney opened her mouth as if to answer, then closed it again, and I watched something behind her eyes finally give way, the practiced composure she had worn through every earlier confrontation simply running out of road. The board voted immediately to suspend her from her position, and the wider membership went on to vote her out entirely, along with authorizing an independent audit covering her full term as president. A few of the older residents who had defended her loudest in earlier meetings sat in silence, with their hands folded in their laps, and one woman near the back quietly said she felt foolish for ever doubting the man who had only ever asked to see the paperwork. Delaney gathered her folder and left the room, and this time nobody stepped aside or followed behind her the way they once might have. For the first time in years, her title carried no protection at all, and the silence that followed her out the door said more than any vote count ever could. Over the following months, the audit and the investigation moved through the practical, unglamorous work of setting things right. The findings confirmed that Delaney had concealed her financial connection to Harbor Ridge Environmental, approved a major payment with no supporting transport documentation whatsoever, misclassified several expenses across multiple budget cycles, made unilateral disposal decisions without any valid board vote authorizing them, and used official association correspondence to pressure me the moment I began asking questions she did not want asked. Delaney eventually accepted a legal settlement requiring her to repay the misappropriated funds, cover a portion of the environmental remediation costs, complete a period of supervised probation and community service, remain barred from holding any homeowners association leadership position for a fixed number of years, and face a separate licensing board review connected to her consulting business. The association dropped every fine that had ever been levied against me and reimbursed the cost of my original inspection request in full. Tessa stepped into the role of interim president, but rather than consolidating that power the way her predecessor had, she pushed through a set of reforms designed to prevent exactly what had just happened from happening again. Every major contract now required at least 2 competing bids. Vendors had to disclose their true ownership before any payment could be approved. Every significant expense needed 2 separate signatures. Environmental documentation had to be stored on a shared system accessible to the entire board. Nobody was permitted to summon police over a civil dispute again unless there was genuine, immediate danger involved. The drain in front of my house was fully replaced within a few weeks, and the county installed a water level sensor along with a complete inspection of the surrounding pipeline. During the first serious rainstorm after the work was finished, I stood at my window and watched water move quickly and cleanly down into that drain and disappear exactly the way it was supposed to. There was no black water rising back up through the seams. There was no acrid smell drifting across the yard, and there was no white SUV parked crooked across the end of my driveway. I ran into Delaney a few weeks later in a parking lot outside the county administration building. She told me all of this could have been avoided if I had simply known, in her words, when to step back and let the people in charge handle things properly. I told her she had been the person in charge, and that was exactly why she was the one left carrying the consequences. She looked away without another word. I never felt like I had won some contest against a woman who happened to lose her position of authority. What I felt instead was relief, the plain kind that comes from watching someone stop being able to hide behind a title, a phone call to emergency dispatch, and the assumption that nobody would ever check what she was standing on top of. Delaney had buried those bags believing that water, dirt, and the weight of her own authority would keep them hidden forever. Some evenings I still walk out to the edge of my yard after a hard rain just to watch the water move the way it should, gathering at the new grate and vanishing without argument, without resistance, without anything left underneath it, waiting to push back. Tessa tells me the reforms have held steady since the audit closed, that vendors now compete honestly for every contract, and that nobody on the board has tried to silence a resident with a phone call to emergency dispatch since the night mine went out. Gideon still does occasional work for the association, though these days every invoice he submits comes with photographs, weight tickets, and a signature from someone other than the person writing the check. Evelyn keeps her doorbell camera pointed at the street out of habit more than necessity now, and Grant tells me the sensor buried beneath my drain has not registered a single irregular reading since the day it was installed. I think about that afternoon often, kneeling in the grass with my hook in hand, absolutely certain I was only there to stop a flood. I had no idea I was also about to uncover a woman's entire scheme to erase evidence of her own greed by burying it beneath the one place on this street where water was always guaranteed to come looking for it eventually. Delaney built her plan on the assumption that authority alone would be enough to keep people from asking questions, and for a while it very nearly was. But no title, no phone call, and no amount of confidence can hold back water once it decides where it needs to go. Water always finds a way through eventually, and in the end, so does the truth.